Now, stereotypes are part of most cultures. They're in part how individual groups often create identity, because in order to create an identity of us, we need another. We need someone to contrast with. The issue becomes when the stereotype is the only representation that is accepted or known within a specific culture or within specific cultures. So, we have stereotypes today about, Swedes or Italians or, Italians are all good cooks. But that's not the only image we see of Italians is as cooks. Whereas with indigenous people, going back to the 18th century, two kinds of main stereotypes develop, partly rising out of philosophical discussions in European culture, French philosophy, this idea, what is the nature of man in his pre-civilized state? And this is a political debate that involves people like John Locke and Hobbes and Voltaire and French scholars. And this idea, is man in his natural state at harmony, at peace, and this is the natural state of man, or is man in his natural state, and I use man here meaning men and women, or people in their natural state savages, uncontrolled, and that governments are necessary to control them. And so what we see happening with identity in Native Americans is that Native Americans get pushed into these two extremes. So we have this idea, and this one is called the noble savage, this idea of the Native person who lives in harmony with nature, who is morally upright, who is truthful, who is correct, who is trustworthy, and that he becomes corrupted by civilization. The other extreme is the savage, what I sometimes call the ignoble savage, that this is this uncontrollable, bloodthirsty, wild Native person who's a threat. And these are the two kinds of extremes. Beginning in the 19th century, in European and American culture, we see these two extremes represented in popular culture, in literature, particularly at the time, to a lesser degree in painting. And these become the predominant, if not exclusive, images of Native peoples. Because most Americans, by the 19th century, like most Europeans, have never encountered a Native person, an American Indian, and never will encounter one. In the 19th century, they were small in number, they lived in remote reservations, and so these stereotypes become the only images that are available. In the 19th century, we see, for example, James Fenimore Cooper, one of the first great American novelists of the 19th century, who writes a series of novels, the best known of which is The Last of the Mohicans, in Czech Poslední Mohikan, novel, film. And he creates these two stereotyped characters. You have the noble savage, and their role in the novel is to help the white hero achieve his goals, protect him from the bad Indians, the noble savage. And he fulfills that role through protection, through help, but in the end, he, of course, sacrifices himself for the white man. That's the role of the noble savage. That becomes the role. And of course, in Cooper novels, he dies, the good Indians die, the noble savages die, but of course the savages also die. They die trying to kill the white man. The noble savage dies trying to save the white man. And this becomes the stereotypical kind of image in literature that we see. We see it in what are called in North America dime novels, this pulp fiction, popular fiction. In the 19th century, as printing becomes more available, paper is cheaper, books become cheaper. So we get the popular literature, not important novels like Cooper, but popular literature, what we call dime novels in the United States, which were cheaply bound, cheaply printed books that almost anyone could afford. And the popular genre was Indians, stories with Indians. And this becomes in this imagery of savages being defeated by the white man. This then gets transferred to Europe. So in the late 19th century, we of course have Karl May and his Winnetou series, originally published in German, then translated into Czech very early on, where he repeats the stereotypes of Cooper, the ones that become established in the United States. So this is the imagery in literature. In parallel with this, in the second half of the 19th century, we have Indian wars. We have the American military moving onto the Great Plains and repressing the native populations, restricting them to reservations, and a series of battles happen, and the Indians are eventually defeated. And so this then becomes this imagery in newspapers about Indians being defeated, these savages, merciless savages. And so this is the imagery then in the media of these savages who are resisting civilization. They're resisting Christianity. They're resisting being brought into the American identity. They want to stay outside of it. So that's an image in the media. And then we get a new imagery in popular culture, and that's something called Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. Buffalo Bill was someone who had been out on the Great Plains, who had traveled around the Great Plains, and this is the era of popular entertainment. You know, what did people do before they went to the movies? Well, they went to the circus, or they went to the theater, or they went to these kinds of extravaganzas. And Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show is one of these extravaganzas, where he recreated historical events where Indians were defeated. So he traveled around the United States, he had a show, horses, and he had Indians. He had real Native Americans performing with him. And of course, they always die in the end of the show. This then comes to Europe, travels around Europe. It was in Brno. So people saw this imagery. And of course, the imagery was where these battles had taken place. And the battles of the second half of the 19th century take place on the Great Plains of the United States, where there's a certain visual imagery. And that visual imagery is the buckskins, the pants, the feather headdress. And this then becomes the imagery that Europeans, because they really had never seen native peoples, they didn't know what they looked like, they didn't know who they were. So this becomes the imagery that we then see. And it becomes the fixed dominant imagery, both here and in the United States. This imagery of native peoples as hunters who hunted buffalo, who lived in teepees, and who wore feather headdresses, and were either harmoniously living with nature or were violent savages. And in any event, they all disappear.